Walk through the Roman Forum in the age of Cicero or of Augustus, and the contradiction would have been visible before anyone explained it. The Forum was the low public valley between Rome's hills, the place later Romans joined to assemblies and law courts, temples and public business, memory and power. It was not born a marble stage for politics. In the earliest landscape, the ground lay low, wet and awkward. Water gathered there, and a brook ran down toward the Tiber. And before the Forum could become the center of Roman public life, the valley had to be cleared and drained, filled, surfaced, and made usable. That physical change matters because public life needs a place where bodies can gather. An assembly is not only an institution written in a later handbook, it is people standing somewhere. A market is not only exchange, it is a reachable space where goods and debts, news and authority meet. A temple is not only belief, it is a building with a site and a root, a view and a claim upon attention. When the Forum Valley becomes usable, Rome gains more than dry ground. Rome gains a center. Later Romans credited much of that transformation to kings. They remembered kings as the men who gave Rome its sacred places and its public works, its ordering systems and its monumental ambition. Yet in the same political culture, to call a living Roman rex king was close to political ruin. Rex was no mere title of office. It was a word that carried the memory of domination and arrogance, of dynastic power, and of the last ruler driven from the city. Rome kept the works of kings and poisoned the name. That is the paradox this episode walks. The last kings of Rome matter less as recoverable lives than as the names later Romans gave to the making of their first real city. Tarquin, Servius, and the last monarchy tradition stand at the point where villages near the Tiber become an urban community, with public ground and temples, drainage, ranked citizens, and a skyline grown large enough to announce ambition. And the same tradition then explains why the Republic defined itself against kingship forever after. The sources ask for caution from the very beginning. The literary tradition gives Rome 7 kings across roughly 250 years, and that is too neat and too long to use as plain history. Later Roman writers dressed the regal period in the forms they knew from the Republic, as though the early kings were elected, ratified, advised, and restrained by procedures that belong more surely to later political life. The kings were modernized by the very historians who claimed to describe them. There was probably some form of monarchy or of strong personal rule. The polished royal sequence is not a documentary record. The word rex itself needs explanation. In later Latin, it means king. In early Rome, the reality behind it may have been rougher than any formal monarchy in the later constitutional sense. The archaic rex perhaps nearer a powerful chief, a war leader, a big man, than a monarch seated inside a finished state. That does not make the kingship imaginary. The Regia, an old sacred building in the Forum, whose name means something like royal house, survived into later Rome. The Rex Sacrorum, a priestly title meaning king of sacred rites, survived after political kings had supposedly been driven out, and an archaic inscription names a rex. These traces give no clean royal diary. They show that Rome remembered and preserved some early form of royal authority. The ground is firmer than the genealogies. Around 650 BC, huts in the future Forum area were cleared away and replaced by a beaten earth public surface. By about 625 BC, the area had grown, public buildings had appeared, and nearby, private houses of stone with tiled roofs had begun to rise. Temple evidence follows in the 6th century. None of this proves the personal deeds of any single king. It shows that Rome was changing bodily in the late 7th and 6th centuries BC. The contrast is worth dwelling on. A genealogy is a list of named persons and family connections, and Rome's royal genealogies are late and unstable. A surface in the ground is another matter. A filled valley, a shrine, a drain, a roof tile, a public building, these do not say which king ordered them. They say that the community had reached an order of organization where work could be planned, labor gathered, and shared space maintained. For this episode, that is the safer foundation. The chronology matters because it draws the useful regal period toward the centuries where the digging actually shows a city forming. The regal period sits better compressed toward roughly 650 to 510 BC, not because those numbers solve everything, but because they fit the transformation better than a long, smooth royal pageant beginning in 753. The account becomes more believable as a memory of urban growth in the late 7th and 6th centuries than as 7 neat lives stretched across an impossible span. Nor was the Rome of this period sealed away from its neighbors. The last kings are bound to the Etruscan question, for the Tarquins were remembered as Etruscans, and the Etruscan cities stood among the richest and most powerful communities of central Italy while Rome was becoming urban. The Etruscans were no small single tribe. They were a family of city communities to Rome's north and northwest, active in trade and religion, art and writing, display and political culture, and their influence upon early Rome was strong. That is why Etruscan influence should be explained rather than worn as a label. It can mean elite names and marriage connections. It can mean religious forms and temple styles, public symbols, art, writing, and the prestige of neighboring cities already wealthy and urban. It can mean the movement of people, and not only the movement of ideas. The Tarquin tradition preserves the memory of outsiders entering Roman power, and that memory fits a central Italian world in which status could travel across the boundaries of cities. But strong influence is no simple tale of foreign masters civilizing passive Romans. The interaction between Rome and Etruria was intense, and the transformation of 6th century Rome cannot be reduced to a crude overlord model. Rome was becoming a city inside a wider central Tyrrhenian world, where Etruscan and Latin, Greek-connected, and local Italian influences met and mingled. The best picture is not conquerors and pupils. It is a world of mobile elites and borrowed forms, shared styles, armed followings, religious prestige, and ambitious communities learning from one another. Servius Tullius shows how unstable the memory could be. In later Roman tradition, Servius becomes the great organizer, the king who counts citizens, ranks them by wealth, ties standing to military service, and gives the city its political shape. Yet even antiquity kept rival versions of who he was. In one Etruscan version, quoted by the Emperor Claudius, Servius appears under the name Mastarna, an armed adventurer joined with Caelius Vivena and a defeated band. Other traditions made him slave-born or the son of a noble captive. These are no small inconsistencies. They point to a remembered world in which power could move through households and militias, migration and personal followings, and not through tidy inheritance alone. Servius' importance lies in the kind of order later Romans fastened to his name. They credited him with the census, the classes, the centuries, the tribes, even the walls. A census was a counting and assessment of citizens, not merely how many people existed, but who held what property, what rank, what military obligation, what political weight. Classes were groupings by wealth. Centuries were units of voting and of war in the later Roman system. And together, these ideas joined what a man owned, how he served, and how his voice counted. The fully developed system known from the Republic cannot simply be set down in the 6th century BC. The later centuriate assembly, the precise property classes, and the elaborate voting machinery are too developed to be accepted as Servius' literal work in their familiar form. But the memory keeps its importance, because Romans needed an origin for one of their deepest habits, the counting of citizens and the weighting of public power through property and military service. Servius, in Roman memory, becomes the king who made the people legible. That word, legible, is worth holding. A population becomes politically legible when the state can see it in categories: who owns enough to arm himself, who serves where, who votes with which group, who belongs to which tribe, who owes what to the community. The Servian memory says that Rome did not become a city only by building walls and temples. It became a city also by sorting its people into public order. And such sorting is never neutral. If wealth determines equipment, the richer citizen appears in heavier military and political form. If voting units are arranged by property, the public voice does not fall evenly upon every adult man. If the state knows who can serve, who can pay, and who belongs where, then the citizen is protected and measured in the same motion. The Servian tradition matters because it gives Rome an origin for that bargain. Public belonging, in exchange for being counted, ranked, armed, and used. The wall tradition belongs to the same memory and asks the same caution. Later Romans spoke of the Servian wall, but the surviving stone circuit that carries the name belongs to the early 4th century after the Gallic sack, and not securely to Servius himself. That does not empty every earlier defensive memory. 6th century Rome may have had earthworks, mounds, or ditches behind the later account. The safe point is not that Servius built the later stone wall as historical Rome saw it. The safe point is that Romans remembered him as the ruler of enclosure, of ranking, and of the civic boundary. His sacred landscape looks outward as well. The Temple of Diana on the Aventine was remembered as a Servian foundation, the Aventine being a hill on the southern side of Rome, near routes and spaces tied to movement, trade, and the river. Diana, a goddess whose cult could carry regional prestige. The shrine mattered beyond local devotion. It rivaled the famous sanctuary at Aricia. It spoke to Rome's standing among the Latin communities, and it set Rome inside a wider Western Mediterranean world touched by Greek and Etruscan forms. So Servius is remembered doing two things at once. He orders Rome inward, counting and ranking the citizens, and he turns Rome outward, giving it a shrine that claims standing among its neighbors. The city is not only being administered, the city is being announced. If Servius is the king of remembered order, Tarquinius Superbus is the king of remembered scale and remembered danger. His name means Tarquin the Proud, and Roman tradition makes him the last king, the tyrant whose household finally makes monarchy unbearable. Yet hostile memory still credits the Tarquinian monarchy with public works of great consequence, and that is what makes the episode more interesting than a tale of wicked kings. The last king could be hated and still be remembered as a builder. The strongest physical image is drainage. The early Forum basin was wet, flood-prone low ground, cut by water moving toward the Tiber. Later tradition attached early drainage work to Tarquinius Priscus and stronger channeling to Tarquinius Superbus, and the Cloaca Maxima, the great drain of Rome, belongs to that memory. Cloaca means simply sewer or drain, and Maxima means greatest. In its early form, it was not the romantic underground monument of later Rome. It was the practical mastery of water, fill, channel, and flow, so that low ground could become civic ground. That point should not be hurried past. A city does not become a city when someone declares it so. The center has to work. Mud and runoff, standing water and flood-prone paths must be made into usable public space. Drainage allows markets and meetings, processions, sacred buildings, and the traffic of politics to occupy the valley. Without the mastery of water, the Forum remains an inconvenience between hills. With it, the valley can become Rome's public floor. Later Romans lived on with the consequences of that old intervention. The line of the drains endured through rebuilding upon rebuilding, and old sewers first laid beneath public ground later ran beneath private houses as the city changed above them. It is one of the best images of archaic city-making that survives. The first works do not vanish when later Rome grows over them. They remain underneath, shaping what later generations take for natural urban form. The labor behind that transformation explains, too, why monarchy could be remembered with resentment. Monumental drainage and temple building require command. Someone must gather the workers and move the stone, manage the timber, dig the channels, line the drains, fill the ground, and keep the work going season upon season. The later tales of Tarquinian harshness may be embroidered, but great public works in an archaic city almost certainly rested upon concentrated authority. The same power that makes a city visible can feel like domination to the people made to build it. The Capitoline Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus gives the same lesson in sacred form. The name means Jupiter best and greatest, the supreme Roman god as worshipped on the Capitoline, the hill that became Rome's commanding sacred height. The great temple was probably above all the work of Tarquinius Superbus. Whatever softer traditions spread the credit backward. It was Etruscan in style, enormous for its age, and a statement of ambition set upon the skyline. The temple mattered because it joined religion to scale. A great temple does not merely say that a city worships. It says that the city can command labor and wealth, artistry, ritual authority, and public space. It tells neighbors and citizens alike that Rome is becoming a place that can build like a power. Under the Tarquinian name, the Capitoline becomes the sacred roof over the Forum city below. Set the pieces together, and the last kings grow clearer. The Regia keeps a royal sacral memory in the Forum, the drained valley makes a public center, the Servian tradition counts and ranks the citizen body, the Aventine Diana looks outward toward Latium and the wider sea, the Capitoline Jupiter crowns the skyline, and Etruscan influence gives form, style, and prestige without reducing Rome to a passive colony. What later Romans called the Age of Kings is the memory of Rome becoming visibly urban. Then the same memory turns against kingship. Final trigger belongs to the Lucretia tradition, which the next episode owns in full. Here it should stand only as the boundary of the kingship story. Sextus Tarquinius, son of the last king, commits sexual violence against Lucretia. Her death, the oath sworn over her body, and the revolt that follows become the Roman explanation for the expulsion of the Tarquins. This episode need not retell the whole tragedy. It needs to show why the tragedy could fasten so powerfully to the word rex. By the time the Republic tells the tale, kingship has become more than one form of government. It has become a moral warning. Rex means the man whose household can swallow the city, power gathered into one family, command without restraint enough, the public world treated as a private possession, the ruler whose son can turn standing into violation and expect the city to endure it. That is why the accusation kept its power. In later Roman politics, to say that a man wished to be rex was no neutral constitutional claim. It was an attack upon his character, his ambition, and his relation to the Republic. A Roman accused of wanting kingship was accused of wanting to stand above law and office, above civic equality among the ruling order, and the title could be a political death sentence because the Roman memory itself was severe. The accusation worked, besides, because Rome's aristocratic politics rested on competition among men who claimed to be peers. A consul could be powerful for a year, a general could win glory, a noble house could gather prestige, but a king implied a different kind of height, one that did not step back into the ordinary contest. To call a man rex was to say that he wanted his greatness to stop being temporary, accountable, and shared. The Republic did not erase the royal residues. It kept the Regia, it kept the Rex Sacrorum, a priest who carried the old royal word in religious form while holding no political crown. It kept the tales of Numa, of Servius, of the Tarquins, because too much of Rome's civic identity rested upon them. It kept the works, and rejected the living claim. That is not carelessness. It is how Roman political culture managed an inheritance it could neither fully honor nor fully discard. Even the emperors understood the danger. Centuries later, men who held armies and provinces, priesthoods, tribunician powers, and authority far beyond any archaic king still refused the title rex. They could possess power that looked royal, the name stayed contaminated. Rome had learned to part the substance of command from the forbidden word, or at least to pretend that it had. The tale of the last kings must therefore be told without two easy mistakes. The first is to treat the kings as plain historical persons whose deeds can be narrated as though a court reporter stood beside them. The evidence does not allow it. The second is to dismiss them as empty legend. The city under their names is too visible for that. The ground changed, the Forum formed, the sacred heights rose, the royal sacral traces remained. Citizens were imagined as countable and rankable, and Rome entered a larger Etruscan and Mediterranean world. The truest version of this history lives inside the contradiction rather than smoothing it away. Kingship made Rome legible as a city, and then became intolerable as a political future. The Tarquins and Servius stand for drainage and ranking, sacred scale, Etruscan contact, and public ambition. They stand also for the memory of domination that made Roman aristocrats recoil from the word king for centuries. So when later Romans walked through the Forum, they were walking through an argument. The stones and the drains, the shrines and the sacred houses said that monarchy had helped make Rome. The political language of the Republic said that monarchy could never be allowed to return. Rome kept the city the kings had made and built a political identity around refusing the title that had made the city possible.